Hello, Revelation scholars, and welcome to the second part of our series on the seven seals. And we want to continue where we left off. We finished with the general overview, and then we went and looked at the four initial seals with the opening of the seals by the Lamb of God, and now that opening has produced four horses to appear that successively are getting more and more threatening. We have ended with death. Now we turn to the fifth seal. The fifth seal starts off with a very interesting perspective that is very troubling and has caused a lot of confusion. If we look at Revelation 6, we find that in the fifth seal, verse 9, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered because of the word of God and the testimony they had been given. Here we have the martyrs that have died for the cause of Christ. What a sad thing to do, but this was very common in the first century, and of course already in Acts we have experienced that several of the leaders of the church have already died, and probably many others that just go unnamed. You know of Stephen and of James, of course, but there are many others that seem to be persecuted, that need to flee, but some of them cannot flee. Saul is very adamant in putting people in prison and probably even persecuting and killing some of them. So here we have the fifth seal with the martyrs. And not only is it a historic reality, it is also something that comes very naturally after the fourth seal. You remember the fourth seal is this horse, this pale green horse, and it has authority to kill by the sword, by famine, by plague, and by wild animals of the earth. A lot of sadness here at the end of the fourth seal. And even though no question is asked, it seems like a very natural thing to say, well, how are the people of God faring? How are those that have died for the cause of Christ doing? How long until those who live on earth can avenge our blood? And this question that the martyrs rise is an important one that the historic churches were probably asking to some extent, and that we still face today. Couple things we need to keep in mind. The first thing is Jesus is still the one opening the seals. When he opened the fifth seal, this is now a continuation of the fourth when he opened, the third when he opened, the second when he opened, and going back to the very beginning of the chapter where it says, I saw the Lamb open one of the seven seals. The Lamb is also the one opening the fifth seal. This already puts this into a relationship, into a context. Jesus is the one that brings out the situation that is going to come, namely the martyrs and their speech and their request. The second thing that we need to keep in mind is that this is still in hypersymbolic language. You remember us talking repeatedly about this, and we've just had four horses that are jumping around, flying across the heavens and the skies. Those were not literal, and nor is the fifth seal a literal seal. We can't just jump back and forth between literal and figurative. This is not a reality. There is not a group of decapitated or killed or dead people that are still alive somewhere beneath the heavenly altar in the heavenly sanctuary. That is not the case. If this was literal, there would be a lot of questions that we would need to ask. For example, why are they under the altar? Why not on top of the altar? And why is the weight of it resting on them? And why are they being forced to stay in this location while everybody else is being allowed to move freely in the heavenly realms, if immortality of the soul is an important aspect to one's belief system? So this is very peculiar, and again, it's a hyper-symbolic language that puts into words what the audience is thinking. how long does it take, and what happens? What is the cause of this? How do we react to the death of hundreds and thousands of people? Notice that we have this question here, and that it is because of the Word of God and the testimony they had given that they are being indicted here. This is again a relationship between God, the Lamb, and the people, and again in return as well, the people have done something for God. One other thing that we need to notice is that this is, from now on, we have an interesting back and forth that we have in the rest of the chapter. In the four opening horses have looked at the effects on earth. The Lamb is opening seals, and there is some effect that this has on the earth. And we see that in the form of four horses. But now in the fifth seal, we have a very different view. We have that of an altar, apparently that of a temple, because we'll hear about altar repeatedly, but always in the sanctuary motif and collection. Here they are speaking, but this is now then a look into the heavenly sanctuary. For John, the earthly sanctuary most likely, fairly clearly, does not exist anymore. And he is just concerned with the heavenly sanctuary. So here we have a scene of the results of the opening of the seal in heaven. In the sixth seal, we return to earth to see the final and climactic seal that is being opened and that destroys the world as we know it. And then the seventh seal is an opening of a heavenly scene in which there is quiet and peace in heaven. So we have this back and forth, the earthly effects, the heavenly effects, the earthly effects, the heavenly effects that go on. Now we turn to the altar. It's kind of a peculiar thing to mention an altar, but not to specify anything more than that. As you very well know, the sanctuary, of course, had two altars, one in which incense was burned, and the other that was a burnt altar for sacrifices. But John fails to mention which altar he has in mind. Which one should we imagine at this place? Is this about the altar that is in the holy place? Is this the incense altar? Or is this the altar that is found in the courtyard, namely the sacrificial altar, the burnt offering? John is not very clear, and some have argued that John actually blends the two into one. He doesn't see so much of a distinction between the altar for incense and the altar for burnt sacrifices. He views them as functioning in the same way. They belong together. They can't be separated. And so he will just talk of an author. That doesn't mean that John is not aware of the multiplicity of authors. He's just pointing out an important theological fact. The imagery of under versus atop or besides, which would in many ways might be more appropriate, has been much debated. One of the concepts and ideas that seems to have the most traction is that it has some sprinkling allusion. In the Old Testament ritual service, quite a bit of blood was sprinkled before the altar or sprinkled at the curtain. This is particularly true in the Day of Atonement, where this concept of sprinkling is used repeatedly. Others have argued that this might be a reference to the throne, that the altar in some places in Scripture seems to be equivalent with the throne of God. Some of the Jewish writings equate this. Even in Revelation 8, 3 and 4, we have that single use of a altar, in which it refers most likely to the incense altar. But then we also have chapter 9, verse 13, and 24 and 6. The martyrs have concluded their earthly journey. But surprisingly, their request, even though their death has come very violently, their death is not a question that entices violence or anger. They're looking and asking about God's justice. They're not looking into God's punishment so much. Look at how they phrase this. First of all, they open by explaining that God is the only true and holy God in verse 10. This already sets the stage that this is very closely connected, and that the people are very aware here, the martyrs, of the character of God. So it's placed into the setting of God's character of being holy and true. Not in you are an angry God or you're a capricious God. No, you're one who is holy and true. And now a question comes that inquires about justice. How long could you judge those who live on earth and avenge our blood? Here, even though the word avenge is used, the idea is more of receive justice, get the right course, rather than I'm looking for retaliation. So this is language that is surprisingly mild-tempered. The martyrs are not angry people, even though they have died a violent death. And that is noted at the very end. The reference and the question to how long is intertextual connection to Psalm 78 and 79, as well as Zechariah 1, verse 12. In 1 verse 12 of Zechariah, we have the conclusion of the four horsemen, and the response is, how long will this peace last? And the idea that we have from that vision in Zechariah is that God will break the peace, not because he's against peace, but because it's a peace, if you remember correctly, that this is a peace predicated upon the oppression of people. So God calls all people to be free from oppression and free from opposing people. Here now we have a similar idea. God produces in the next seal in Revelation another similar status like we find in Zechariah. There is more turmoil that will come. God acts in the sixth seal with calamity, but not because of vengeance, but because of justice. Now we turn to the response that these martyrs receive, and that is a peculiar response. You've already heard it as I've read it. They were given a white robe. They were told to rest a little longer until the number would be completed of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters who were going to be killed just as they had been. This is the conclusion in verse 11 of chapter 6 of the fifth seal. Rest a little while longer. This is not too hard to understand. It refers to the idea that the end of all time has not yet arrived. The parousia is not yet here. There's more that needs to happen. The justification has not been completed, that process, and so wait a little longer. Also, the reference to white robes is significant as a sign of victory or purity. They have succeeded, and they are now counted among those that are waiting the second coming. Again, this is of course symbolic and not a literal aspect. But we must also note that there is one peculiar thing that the text needs to wrestle with, a problem that actually arises from the Greek. In the second part, we have this, rest a little while longer until the number would be completed of their fellow servants. And this reference to number is one that is actually not in the text. The text has a blank here, or doesn't talk about anything at all. The question, though, is wait a little while longer until, well, until what? And the text does have the second part, of course, that we have, and that is, and their brothers and sisters who were going to be killed just as they had been, servants and brothers. Very relational language again. But it doesn't have the number. That's the direct object. What I've just read is the descriptor that describes who is being affected and what is going to happen, but number is very crucial, and yet it's missing in the Greek text and in all the manuscripts. So it's something that has been inserted, added to make sense of the text. But some people, for example Custer, have stressed that this might not be the best answer to the solution. If we put in number, the word number in here, if we insert that into the text as a logical thing, then that actually produces some awkward readings. If I read to you again here from the Contemporary Standard English Bible, until the number would be completed of their fellow servants and brothers and sisters who were going to be killed just as they had been. This seems that God somewhere on a shelf or on a blackboard has a specific number, and when that is reached, then the sixth seal can appear. But before that, whatever that number is, which we don't know, we just need to wait till that is fulfilled. This is an odd reason, because it seems to be that God is just waiting for more people to die. That doesn't square very well with the image that we have of God and of Jesus. Additionally, Custer notes that whenever John wants to use numbers, the word, he always is very clear that he needs to specify it. For example, in chapter 7, verse 4, he says, "And I heard the number of the sealed," and then he proceeds with all kinds of numbers. In that case, the word number could have been implied, and it would have made sense anyway. So even in places where you don't need it, it's actually there. So why here, where we have a missing word, why doesn't John supply it here? Well, the answer might be that he's actually not wanting to refer to a number. That he wants to not give the impression that God is waiting just for more people to die. Custer argues that it is not the number of people, but the number of what they are called to do, the completeness of what they are called to do. He says, the point is not that Christians need to finish a fixed number of works. That is not the point. Just as the martyrs under the altar were faithful in witness up to the point of death, and have received their white robes, so their fellow servants on earth will finish their course in the same way. So it is not completion of the number, but completion of their work that is being stressed. And that work is to be faithful. They were complete in their faithfulness to God. Completion, then, is not the completion of a specific number of people so that Jesus can come, and we just need more people to be martyrs so that Jesus can finally come. That would be in violation of everything that we know about the God of heaven and earth, of the Creator who values life and doesn't want anybody to perish. Instead, the reference should indicate that this is completeness or faithfulness of what we are called to do. And that includes the martyrs, but it also includes each one that is not a martyr. This is a generic call. Because the seal is the fifth seal, and we've already noted that there have been martyrs in the first century, and that these seals very often have a larger development, they overlap. It's also quite possible that this overlaps with with the four horsemen, and that this already is a reflection on people that have gone and died before the time span that we usually associate to this aspect. This is a continuous thing that can happen throughout all of humanity's history, that people die for God's cause. Now we turn to the sixth seal. The sixth seal is clear in its application and its setting, where it is supposed to be placed. As we've already discussed, the seals and the trumpets figure the time frame from the opening, from the author's time, which is a reference to Jesus' ascension, all the way to the second coming. And here we have that event that closes the events. This is the imagery of the day of the Lord. Revelation 6 talks about many elements and has a cosmic dimension to it. Even though we're talking about things on earth, such as mountains and things related to the earth, sun, moon, and skies, and the stars, they are nonetheless impacts of what is happening and happening on earth. The cosmic dimension is very clear, and large parts of it are reminiscent of things that you have heard before. The whole idea of sun, moon, and stars being affected by this opening of the seal is a clear reference to Matthew 24, where this is almost taken verbatim. But not only do we have an indirect link to Matthew 24, also Joel 2 and Amos 8 are references that are being included, as well as Isaiah chapter 2. All of these culminate. In fact, we even have some allusions to the Petrine epistles that also talk, for example, in 2 Peter 3 about the destruction of the earth and how it will be that everything will be destroyed by fire. We have an allusion to that imagery here in this passage. This is a very traumatic event, especially for those that do not fall on the side of those awaiting the return of the Lamb. The day of the Lord in the Old Testament is both a positive figure and a positive imagery, God coming back to be with his own and to redeem his people. But it's also a negative image for all those that have declined and rejected God and his ways, for there will now be judgment against them. Here in this final seal, we have particularly a view on those that do not follow God's plan. We see them hiding in caves and in rocks and asking these to fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Here both God the Father and the Lamb are introduced as the object of worship, but these individuals cannot worship the Lamb and God as all the others have done. This is hearkening back to chapter 4 and 5. Everybody there saw the one on the throne and the Lamb, and they began to worship. But here these individuals do not worship. The opposite happens. They instead beg to die, or they beg to not have to view this sight. This is a very stark contrast to the positive image that we've already seen of the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures. Here people are standing against it. This is very clearly a reference to the day of the Lord, with the many allusions to the Old Testament and even parts of the New Testament. Here culmination, both vindication but also judgment are happening and are implied. And that means people are either happy or very distraught at what is about to happen, namely the coming of the Son of Man. In itself, it comes back to the justification of God and follows as something right out of the 5th seal. How long do we need to wait? And now God responds. Certainly there is some element of time between the question of the martyrs and God's response, but nonetheless it seems there's a certain connection and flow that the martyrs have asked this important question, the martyrs in heaven, and they have been heard. God is acting on the behalf of his people. What a wonderful image. And right here, we begin to turn the leaf from a very negative opening where we had 4 horses riding, culminating in death, and martyrs. Now we begin to turn the tide, and you'll see in the interlude that we're going to go into next that we're now turning to a positive dimension of all of this. The culmination of Earth's history has been now introduced, but it leaves one question: who is able to stand? In light of all the destruction that happens, all the bad things that are happening at once, we already have the death, plague, famine, all of these that continuously keep on damaging and hurting humanity, but now we even have the kings of the earth, the nobles, the generals, the rich and the powerful, those that are not, the earth dwellers that are not connecting to God, they are being punished. This is a huge scene that is slowly developing and growing in intensity, and yet there's also joy. Because those that have followed the Lamb, they are not included here. How can they stand? Well, the answer is, who can stand? The 144,000 and the great multitude. So now we can turn to the positive part of chapter 7. Chapter 7 is an interlude, or a expansion, as some have called it, that answers this question. But it doesn't answer the question directly. It answers it indirectly by giving a new appearance, or a new approach, a new view that John is seeing. He begins with, after this, making a distinction to the sixth seal. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners. Now he's taking a global view, a central view, and making some comments and statements about that. Who is the one that can be here? There's a twofold answer to this how, and that is the 144,000 of Israel and the great multitude. Much of it has been said and repeated about these. We are still in apocalyptic literature. We still have hypersymbolism. Obviously, the 144,000 are a symbolic number, one that runs on the numerals of 12 for sure, because the text itself says 12,000, 12,000, and so on. It is a number that is 12 squared, while the number of the mark of the beast is the half of this. So you see a little bit of the contrast here. The 12,000 signify the full amount of something. But it is surprising to see this list, and much has been done to focus on this list. You know much of it. You know that this is not a list that exists like this in any other place. There's what we might call mistakes, as they aren't the actual or normal way of counting the 12 tribes. One of them is in including Levi in this list. Another one is seemingly double counting, as we have the tribe of Joseph, which was actually replaced by Manasseh and Ephraim. But we also have Manasseh in here, but we don't have Ephraim. So we have an odd list of a chart here. Also, these tribes ranged from very little, for example, Gad and Benjamin were very small tribes, to very huge tribes like Reuben, that were much bigger, or Judah, for example, as well. Huge tribes, and yet there's only 12,000 from each, an equal number. Now, well, again, this isn't that it's trying to be particular about exact numbers, but about the imagery behind it. We've already mentioned that this terminology of counting up things is reminiscent of numbers, where we have the census. And census, as you know from David as well, were always intended to give the king an opportunity to know how big his army was. Today we do census for many reasons: to appropriate democratic votes for representatives, or to know how much hospitals we need to build, or how many post office a region needs based on the number of people that live there. We use it for demographic purposes, for growth, for planning, for city structures. Back then, it was simply used for military campaigns. So this has imagery and overtones of military language, even though they don't engage in war themselves. From the beginning, we see that this is God who is in control. They are the servants. But, very important, in verse 3, we now introduce the seal of God. God as the one who will protect and guide them, and this is placed on the foreheads. Again, symbolic language reminiscent of the law, and that you hold this in your, close to your head, the law, that you remember it. This is the imagery of remembering. The 144,000 are obviously Israelite. This is an important thing to consider. It's kind of stating the obvious, but it's very important as you look at the contrast to the next group. And the next group, notice verse 9, after this I looked, and there was a vast multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language, which no one could number. So besides the 144,000, there is a huge crowd, and we immediately are introduced into the obvious difference. One is Israelite terminology, and the other is universal theology. Everybody is included, every nation, tribe, people, and language. Two different views. Many have already argued and pointed out that this is actually just looking at the same group from two different vantage points. One from the vantage point of the sanctuary in the desert, Deuteronomy, where we have the sanctuary in the center of the camp, and then we have these camps. And many people have pointed out that Deuteronomy is arranged in a military camp strategy. Here we have kind of the same thing. At the center, we have the sanctuary, imaginary, with God and the forehead and the ceiling. And all around that, we now have the encampment of the Israelites. That is the previous part. But now, in the second part, we get a dimension that this is universal in scope. It's not limited just to the Israelites. The Gentiles are equally included, and they sing their praises in a loud voice. Salvation, verse 10, belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb. Here we have a hymn being sung. Notice the very different attitude towards everything that has happened between this group, the great multitude, and the kings and rulers of the earth and the earth dwellers that we saw in the sixth seal. This is how the people of God should respond, versus that was the previous, was how the evil people that have not made a choice for God, how they respond. Here we have two different imageries. The hearing and seeing difference is important. We've already noted that in chapter 5 we have the hearing and seeing of a lamb and of a lion, and we would argue that that is actually a depiction of Jesus. Both of them, the lion and the lamb that is slain. And here similarly we have that same imagery and idea. Both of them refer to the same group, except they do it in different terminology and emphasizing different parts. The wonderful thing, though, is the second part, beginning in verse 13. These are people who are dressed in white robes. They have been given the victory. They are now at peace. They are in a place where God wants them to be. They are the pure ones. These are the ones that have come out of the great tribulation. They have passed through the trials of this earth and now have been placed in the care of God and in the protection of God. There's a very interesting aspect to that, and that is particularly in verse 17. We have an oxymoron, so to speak. For the Lamb who is at the center of the throne will shepherd them. What a weird image to have a lamb be the shepherd. Usually the lamb is the one that is being shepherded by a shepherd. But here it is the shepherd, Jesus, that is being the sheep. A interesting change of imagery. We would expect a shepherd to lead a sheep, but here the sheep leads instead human beings. What an interesting idea. But this is reminiscent of this whole passage, the 144,000 versus the uncountable multitude. We've had the imagery of those who washed their clothes in the blood of the Lamb. The idea of turning something white if it is washed in red. So we have a lot of these opposite images that we have. But the beauty of this chapter is the positive tone in which it closes. We had all the 6 seals that are being opened with all kinds of threats and violence, famine, destruction, but now we hear the positive side. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, the passage ends with a reference to Psalms 23. You know the Psalm 23. It has given countless people hope, and that is the intention here as well. Right after the lamb that is guiding and shepherding, the conclusion of this aspect, this heavenly interlude, is He will guide them to springs of the waters of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. The first part is a reference back to Psalms 23, as I noted. The shepherd there is now the lamb here. And the reference to springs of waters of life, a reference to Jesus himself, who claimed to be the living water. And also a hint towards what will come in the new earth, where we will have water flowing right out of the throne itself. Finally, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. This is something that is future-oriented. This is something that will occur. It hearkens into the completion of all of God's work of salvation and the final glory that will happen once the new creation, the new earth, the new Jerusalem have been created, and God will wipe away every tear. This, of course, we find as a reference in Revelation 21, verse 4. And with this beautiful comfort, the answer is yes. Though it hasn't been answered very directly, yes, there are people that can pass through this difficult time of the 6 seals. There are those that will survive. There are those that will be able to say, I have passed through this. Who is able to stand? I have been able to stand. But not I alone. I've only been able to stand because the Lamb is leading me and has led me in my journey. The final seal is now to be opened. We turn to the last part of this vision, and that is chapter 8, verse 1. Very simple and clear statement. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. The first thing that we need to note again is that we're still in hypersymbolism. The year-day principle, in which we say 1 day in prophetic time equals a year in our historical time, is not that important here. The reason is that we're not dealing with a day at all, we're dealing with half an hour. Whether this principle applies or not is not as important, and what half an hour exactly stands for is also not as important. We'll just leave it as a hypersymbolic number. It's not even quite clear, is half an hour long or is half an hour short? That is not the point. Silence is the point. The absence of talking. There have been several proposals what's happening here. Some have said it talks about an empty heaven. Maybe this is a clearer description of the second coming, in which the heavens are now empty. Others have proposed that this is an awe-inspiring heaven isn't empty, but this is just an expression of awe and amazement. Many of you might have had the chance to go to a European cathedral, in which it's very easy to spend half an hour just in awe of the architecture. Very, very tall ceilings, beautiful stained glass windows, ornate furniture. It is very imposing, and the echo draws you into this experience as well. It's very awe-inspiring. It's not hard to be inspired. Awe-inspired for half an hour. Some have argued that maybe this is a reference to awe or to worship. Others have said we might be able to be more precise even and say this is prayer. The context, the next verses, clearly has a reference to prayer. Maybe this is the silence of prayers ascending to God. The final solution that places this into this historicist time frame is that the second coming has already come at the day of the Lord, though it hasn't been presented as the most positive experience from the perspective of the kings and rulers. That doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't present, even though he's not explicitly mentioned. The reference to Matthew 24 seems to suggest that the Son of Man would be a part of this cosmic dimension of that would be a second coming. So then this would not be a reference to the second coming, but something in the time after. Here, silence has been interpreted to refer to silence in the courtroom. And then this could be a reference to the millennium, the time of judgment in which there is peace and quiet for the judgments to be pronounced and for the process to develop. Either way, it is a very different note that we end here than we end in the opening. A lot more suspense and unknownness compared to the opening of the 4 horses, the martyrs, and then number 6, the second coming, the day of the Lord. The ending, though, focuses now more on the people of God again. For what happens now will be actually the beginning of a view of what happens before God's throne on behalf of the people. And we've already seen that in the previous context of chapter 7. So there is an element of good news in the midst of all the sadness and the negative news that the horses brought and the martyrs brought and the questions that have been raised in the 6th seal. We now conclude with a positive note. God is in control.